The emergency beacon died 3 days ago, but David Reed kept walking anyway. His boots crunched through ash that used to be something living. The research station sat ahead like a broken tooth against the purple sky of Draken 4. Every window was shattered. Scorch marks ran up the walls in patterns that looked almost deliberate. David adjusted his medical pack and checked his scanner one more time. Still nothing. No heat signatures, no movement, no signs of life. Lieutenant Shaw had ordered a quick sweep and extraction. Get in, confirm everyone was dead or gone, get out. Simple enough. The main entrance hung open at a crooked angle. David stepped inside and immediately wished he hadn't. The lobby was a mess of overturned furniture and dry blood. Not human blood, though. It shimmered with an odd iridescent quality under his helmet light. He'd seen plenty of alien biology in his 3 years with the Coalition forces, but this was new. His radio crackled. Read status? Inside the main structure. No survivors visible. Evidence of rapid evacuation or attack. Hard to tell which. Copy that. 15 minutes, then we extract. Don't touch anything. David moved deeper into the facility. The research station had been studying local wildlife, according to the mission brief. Draken 4 was supposed to be mostly empty after the mining corporations stripped it clean 20 years back. Whatever animals remained were meant to be cataloged and preserved. Noble work, except someone had clearly disagreed violently. The lower levels were worse. Entire laboratories had been torn apart. Cages stood empty with their doors ripped off the hinges. Some kind of conflict had happened here, and recently too. The emergency lights still flickered in some sections. That's when David heard it. A tiny chirping sound, barely audible over the hum of dying power systems. He froze and killed his own equipment noise. There was again, coming from behind a collapsed section of wall. Protocol said call it in. Protocol said don't investigate alone. Protocol said a lot of things that seemed less important when something small and alive was making frightened noises in a building full of death. David moved carefully around the debris. His hand rested on his sidearm, just in case. The chirping grew louder. Then he saw them point 3 small creatures huddled together in the corner of what used to be an observation room. They looked like someone had mixed a lizard with a bat and then shrunk the result down to the size of house cats. Scales covered their bodies in overlapping patterns of deep crimson and gold. Small wings pressed tight against their backs. Their eyes were too large for their heads, reflecting his helmet light with an inner glow. Dragon hatchlings. That's what the local legends called them, according to the cultural database. Supposedly extinct, the babies stared at David with obvious terror. The largest one positioned itself in front of the other 2 and opened its mouth. A weak spurt of flame coughed out, barely enough to warm David's glove when he raised his hand. Easy there, David said softly. He'd used the same tone on frightened civilians in a dozen war zones. I'm not here to hurt you. The dragons didn't speak any language he knew, but fear was universal. They were starving. He could see their ribs pressing against their scales. Dehydrated too, based on the way their skin looked dull and papery. David made a decision that would change everything. He reached into his medical pack and pulled out a ration bar. The motion made all 3 babies flinch backward, but desperation kept them from running. He broke off a piece and tossed it gently toward them. The smallest dragon, barely bigger than his boot, stretched its neck out and sniffed. Then it darted forward, grabbed the food, and retreated. The other 2 watched carefully. When nothing bad happened, they crept forward too. David removed his helmet. The recycled air of the station smelled like smoke and chemicals, but he wanted them to see his face. Humans looked scary enough in full combat gear. The dragons needed to know he was just a person. That's it, he murmured, breaking off more pieces. Nobody's going to hurt you. Not while I'm here. The smallest one finished its portion first and took a tentative step closer. Its scales were lighter than the others, almost orange in certain lights. It made a questioning chirp that sounded heartbreakingly hopeful. David stayed perfectly still. The baby dragon moved closer, then closer. Finally, it pressed its snout against David's outstretched palm. The contact sent a strange tingle through his hand, almost like a very mild electric shock. The dragon's eyes widened, and suddenly David felt something that wasn't quite a thought and wasn't quite an emotion. Just a sense of recognition, of connection. The other two dragons saw their sibling touch the human and survive. They rushed forward together, climbing over each other to reach David. He let them come, barely breathing, afraid any movement might shatter this fragile trust. They pushed their heads under his hands, making sounds that vibrated in their chests like a cat's purr, but deeper. His radio crackled again. "Reed, time's up. Return to extraction point." David looked at the three dragons. They looked back at him. The smallest one had climbed partially into his lap and showed no intention of leaving. "Reed, confirm you copy." He thought about the blood in the lobby, the torn cages. Whatever had happened here, these babies had been left behind deliberately or accidentally. Either way, they would die if he left them. Slowly, carefully, David unsealed his backpack and expanded it to maximum size. "I copy," he said into the radio. Then he began gently placing dragons into his pack. They didn't resist. Smuggling 3 dragon hatchlings past military security turned out to be easier than David expected. The extraction team was focused on recovering equipment and documenting the station's destruction. Nobody checked his medical pack too carefully. The babies stayed quiet during the flight back, though he felt them shifting around whenever the transport hit turbulence. The problem started 12 hours later during routine equipment inspection. Lieutenant Shaw stood in David's temporary quarters with her arms crossed and her expression locked somewhere between disbelief and fury. The 3 dragons sat on his bunk, watching the confrontation with intelligent eyes while making small worried chirps. "Explain," Shaw said flatly. David had rehearsed this conversation in his head a dozen times. Every version ended badly. They were abandoned, starving. "I couldn't just leave them to die." "So you brought potentially dangerous xenofauna onto a coalition military base without authorization, proper quarantine, or any kind of clearance whatsoever." Shaw's voice never rose above a professional monotone, which somehow made it worse. "Do you have any idea how many regulations you violated?" 17, David said. "I counted." The smallest dragon, the orange one, chirped louder and moved toward the edge of the bunk. It was trying to get closer to David. The other 2 followed immediately. Within seconds, all 3 had climbed down and were pressing against his legs. Shaw watched this with narrowed eyes. "They've bonded to you." "Seems like it." "Reed, I need you to understand something. Those creatures are classified as dangerous fauna under coalition protocols. I have to report this. Once I do, Xenobiology Research Division will take custody immediately." She paused. "You'll probably face disciplinary action, but they'll be properly cared for." David had spent the entire trip back researching everything available about Draken 4 and its extinct dragon population. He'd found the files on Xenobiology Research Division too. "You mean they'll be dissected?" "That's not my concern." "It should be." David knelt down, and the dragons immediately climbed onto him. The orange one perched on his shoulder. The other 2 settled in his lap. "These aren't just animals, Lieutenant. They're intelligent. I can feel it when they touch me. Something like telepathy, maybe. They understand what's happening around them." Shaw's expression didn't change. All the more reason for proper scientific study. The research station on Draken 4 was trying to resurrect this species through genetic engineering. Mining corporations wiped them out 20 years ago when they stripped the planet. These 3 are the last ones left. David looked up at her. "If we hand them over to be cut apart and studied, we're finishing what the corporation started." For a long moment, Shaw said nothing. The dragons chirped softly, as if they sensed the tension. Finally, she sighed and sat down on the desk chair. 48 hours, she said. "That's how long I can delay filing the official report. After that, I have no choice. Regulations exist for reasons, Reed. We can't just ignore them because we don't like the outcome." David started to argue, but Shaw held up a hand. "Use the time wisely. Figure out what you're actually going to do. Because let me be very clear, if you think you can just keep hiding them in your quarters, you're wrong. Someone will notice. Someone always notices." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I hope you find a solution. But hope doesn't change military law. After she left, David sat on the floor with 3 dragons crawling all over him. They seemed calmer now that the angry human was gone. The orange one licked his cheek with a tongue that felt like warm sandpaper. "What am I going to do with you 3?" he muttered. The largest dragon, the crimson one, made a rumbling sound deep in its chest. It pushed its head under David's hand, clearly demanding attention. The third one, gold with darker streaks, climbed onto his head and settled there like a bizarre hat. David pulled up his datapad and continued researching. 48 hours wasn't much time, but it was something. He searched for precedents, looking for any case where dangerous fauna had been reclassified or protected. There had to be something he could use. The Coalition had strict laws about sentient species. If he could prove the dragons were sapient rather than just intelligent animals, they'd have legal protections. But proving sentience required communication, and the dragons only communicated through feelings when they touched him. That wouldn't hold up in any official review. Hours passed. David barely noticed. The dragons eventually fell asleep in a pile on his lap, their tiny bodies radiating warmth. He kept researching, kept searching, kept hoping for some legal loophole or precedent that would save them. His datapad pinged with a new message. Official Coalition Communications. David's stomach dropped as he opened it. "Attention all personnel. Be advised that Halion Mining Corporation has filed claim to biological materials recovered from Research Station Delta 7 on Draken 4. All recovered materials must be cataloged and prepared for corporate transfer within 72 hours. This includes any genetic samples, tissue specimens, or living organisms. Failure to comply may result in legal action against Coalition forces for interference with corporate property rights." David read it 3 times to make sure he understood correctly. Then he very carefully set down his datapad before he could throw it against the wall. The dragons weren't just classified as dangerous fauna anymore. They were classified as corporate property. Halion Mining Corporation, the same company that had strip-mined Draken 4 into a wasteland, now legally owned the last 3 members of the species they'd helped destroy. The orange dragon stirred and made a questioning sound. It could sense David's distress through whatever connection they shared. The others woke up too, all 3 looking at him with those 2 large, too intelligent eyes. "I won't let them take you," David promised quietly. "I don't care what regulations say. I don't care about corporate property rights. You're not things to be owned." The dragons pressed closer to him, and David felt that strange telepathic tingle again. This time it was stronger, more focused. Not quite words, but something close. A feeling of trust so absolute it made his chest ache. He had 48 hours to figure out how to protect 3 baby dragons from both military regulations and corporate lawyers. It seemed impossible, but David had made a promise. He intended to keep it. Names mattered, David decided. You couldn't fight for something that didn't have a name. You couldn't protect an abstract concept, but you could protect Scout, Shy, and Hum. Scout was the crimson one, bold and curious, always investigating new things first. Shy was the small orange hatchling that preferred staying close to David. Hum made constant vibrating sounds in its chest, a deeper rumble than the others could manage. The gold dragon seemed to use the humming for comfort, both giving it and taking it. Over the next week, the dragons grew at an alarming rate. They went from cat-sized to resembling medium dogs. Their scales hardened and took on deeper colors. Scout's crimson turned almost burgundy. Shy's orange brightened to copper. Hum's gold developed streaks of bronze that caught the light. More importantly, they learned. David taught them basic commands using techniques he'd read about in animal rehabilitation guides. Seat. Stay. Cool me. Quiet. The dragons picked up everything within days. They understood not just the words, but the concepts behind them. Scout especially showed problem-solving abilities that went far beyond animal intelligence. David watched Scout figure out how to open the lock supply cabinet by using its tail to hit the release switch. No trial and error. The dragon studied the mechanism for 10 minutes, then solved it on the first attempt. "You're too smart for your own good," David told Scout. The dragon chirped happily and brought him a ration bar it had stolen from the newly opened cabinet. The real test came during a supply convoy attack. Raiders hit a transport 3 kilometers from the base perimeter. David's unit responded immediately. He locked the dragons in his quarters with strict orders to stay hidden and quiet. They whined when he left, pressing against the door, but they stayed. The ambush was worse than initial reports suggested. David found himself pinned down behind a destroyed vehicle with 2 other soldiers. Enemy fire raked their position from multiple angles. His radio crackled with confused orders and calls for reinforcement. Then Scout landed on the vehicle above him with enough force to dent the metal that David's heart stopped. All 3 dragons had followed him. They must have broken out of his quarters and tracked his scent across 3 kilometers of dangerous terrain. Scout roared, a sound far larger than its body should produce, and exhaled a stream of fire that cut across the raiders' position. The flames weren't hot enough to kill, but they forced the enemy to scatter. In that moment of confusion, Shy and Hum moved. They didn't attack. Instead, they went straight for a wounded soldier lying in the open, exposed to enemy fire. David watched in amazement as both dragons grabbed the soldier's uniform with their teeth, carefully avoiding skin, and dragged him toward cover. They moved in perfect coordination, almost like they were communicating silently with each other. The wounded man was twice their size, but together they managed to pull him behind a barrier. Scout continued creating walls of flame, controlling the raiders' movement, giving David's unit time to reorganize. Within minutes, reinforcements arrived and the enemy retreated. The entire firefight lasted less than 10 minutes, but it changed everything. Lieutenant Shaw arrived 30 minutes later. She surveyed the scene with an unreadable expression. The wounded soldier was being treated by medics. He kept telling everyone about the dragons that saved his life. Other soldiers had seen it too. There was no hiding this anymore. They followed you into combat, Shaw said. I locked them in my quarters. They escaped. David looked at the 3 dragons, who had returned to pressing against his legs. They knew something important was happening. I didn't bring them, but they came anyway. Shaw knelt down and, very carefully, extended her hand toward Shy. The small copper dragon sniffed her fingers, then allowed Shaw to touch its scales. They protected our people. A wounded soldier is alive because of them. Does that matter? Legally, I mean. Shaw stood up and brushed dust off her uniform. I've been doing research, digging through coalition law and precedents. There's a clause about protective actions demonstrating sapient decision-making. If a being makes complex moral choices, prioritizes the welfare of others, shows evidence of ethical reasoning, it can qualify for provisional sentient status. David felt hope flicker to life. These 3 just did exactly that. I know. I recorded the whole thing. Shaw tapped her helmet recorder. But there's a problem. Helion Corporation has legal teams already preparing their claim. They'll argue the dragons were acting on instinct or training or anything except independent moral choice. We need more than one incident. Scout made a low rumbling sound and pressed its head against David's hand. The telepathic connection surged stronger than before. David gasped as emotions flooded through him. Not just feelings anymore. Something deeper. Scout was trying to communicate actual concepts. Protection. Family. Choice. They're getting stronger, David said. The telepathic connection. It's becoming clearer. Give them more time, and I think they'll be able to communicate properly. We don't have more time. Helion's security team arrives in 3 days to collect their property. Shaw's expression hardened. Unless we can prove sentience before then, those dragons are gone. They'll be taken apart in a laboratory to see what makes them valuable. The dragons sensed the distress in both humans. They pressed closer, making worried chirps. Hum's vibrations increased in frequency, a sound meant to comfort. Shy climbed partially up David's leg, demanding to be held. Scout positioned itself between the humans and the rest of the world, protective instincts on full display. Over the next 2 days, David worked with the dragons constantly. He documented everything. Their problem-solving, their emotional responses, their protective behaviors. Shaw helped, recording interactions and building a case file. Other soldiers started visiting to see the dragons. Word had spread about the convoy rescue. The wounded soldier, A man named Peters brought them food and spent an hour just sitting with them. Scout curled up next to him like they were old friends. The dragons seemed to understand that this human had needed help, and that they had provided it on the evening of the second day. David sat with all 3 dragons in his quarters. They had grown again. Scout was nearly the size of a large dog now. Shy and Hum weren't far behind. Their scales had hardened into armor, and their wings had strengthened enough for short, gliding flights. "Tomorrow, people are coming to take you away," David said quietly. "I won't let them. I promise." The dragons looked at him with those enormous, intelligent eyes. The telepathic connection hummed with shared determination. They understood more than he'd realized. They knew they were in danger. They knew David was trying to protect them. And for the first time, David felt something new through the connection. Not just emotions or concepts. Actual words, rough and uncertain, but unmistakable. "Stay together." The voice in his mind was made of 3 parts, all speaking as one. The dragons weren't just intelligent. They were becoming truly sapient. They were learning to speak. The Helion security team landed exactly on schedule. 6 men in corporate military gear, backed by legal authorization that looked airtight. Their leader, a man named Foster with a face like weathered stone, presented his documents to the base commander while David watched from across the landing pad. 3 biological specimens recovered from Helion Mining Corporation property. Foster read from his datapad. Legal ownership established through salvage rights and corporate charter. "We're here to collect and transport to the main research facility." Commander Williams, a career officer with silver hair and a permanent scowl, read through the documents carefully. David knew Williams didn't like corporate interference on his base, but legal was legal. The commander looked up and caught David's eye. There was sympathy there, but also resignation. "The specimens are currently housed in Medical Bay 3, Williams said. "Under guard. Guard won't be necessary. We have containment equipment." David's fists clenched. Containment equipment. They were talking about Scout, Shy, and Hum like they were dangerous cargo instead of living, thinking beings. The dragons were in Medical Bay 3, exactly where David had been ordered to keep them during the transfer. They knew something bad was coming. He'd felt their fear through the telepathic bond all morning. Foster's team moved toward the medical bay with professional efficiency. David followed, unable to stop himself. Lieutenant Shaw fell in his step beside him. "The legal team is filing the appeal right now," she whispered. "But it takes time to process. We don't have time." They reached Medical Bay 3. Foster's team entered first. David heard Scout roar immediately, the sound echoing off the walls. He rushed inside to find all 3 dragons backed into a corner, scales glowing with barely contained heat. They weren't attacking, but they were clearly ready to defend themselves. Foster pulled out a neural suppressor, a device that would knock the dragons unconscious without permanent harm. It was standard equipment for handling dangerous animals. David stepped between the dragons and the security team. "Wait, stand aside, Corporal. This isn't your concern anymore. They're sentient. You can't just take them." Foster's expression didn't change. "Our legal team has reviewed all submitted evidence. Problem-solving and protective instincts don't qualify as sentience under current coalition law. These are valuable biological specimens, nothing more. Now stand aside, or I'll have you removed." The dragons pressed against David's back. Their telepathic voices filled his mind, all 3 speaking at once. Fear, confusion, trust. They were looking to him for protection, the way they had since he'd first found them in that ruined research station. And then they spoke clearly, not just to David, but projecting outward with desperate strength. "Please don't leave us." The words hit everyone in the room like a physical force. Foster stumbled backward. His team members looked at each other in shock. Even Commander Williams, who had just entered the bay, froze in place. The dragons' voices continued, raw with emotion. "Please, don't leave us." It wasn't just words. It was feeling, memory, desperate hope, all compressed into a telepathic plea that resonated in everyone's mind. David felt tears on his face and didn't care. Around him, hardened soldiers and corporate security personnel stood stunned. Foster recovered first. His hand moved toward the neural suppressor again. Telepathy isn't speech. It's not evidence of sentience. I have my orders. Then your orders are wrong, Lieutenant Shaw said. She stepped forward, datapad in hand. I'm invoking Coalition Emergency Protocol 7. When credible evidence of sapient communication emerges during a transfer of biological materials, all actions must halt pending tribunal review. That protocol is for first contact situations with unknown species, Foster argued. It's for any situation where sapience is in question. These dragons just communicated directly, expressing complex emotional states and making requests using language. That qualifies. Shaw's voice was steady. You could try to override the protocol, but it will take days to process. By then, our appeal will have been reviewed. Foster looked ready to argue further, but Commander Williams intervened. Protocol 7 is invoked. Specimens remain on base pending tribunal review. You can file a complaint with Coalition Command if you disagree. The security team leader's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. We'll be staying on base. Those specimens don't leave our sight. Fine. You can observe from outside the medical bay. No direct contact without authorization. After Foster and his team left, David collapsed against the wall. The dragons immediately swarmed him, chirping and pressing close. Their telepathic voices were quieter now, meant only for him. Safe? Still together, David promised. Over the next week, everything escalated. Shaw's invocation of Protocol 7 bought them time, but it also drew attention. Coalition Command sent observers. News of telepathic dragons spread through military channels and then leaked to civilian networks. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion about 3 baby dragons, and the soldier tried to protect them. Halion Corporation responded with their full legal arsenal. They filed briefs arguing that telepathy wasn't true communication. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about animal intelligence mimicking sapience. They pointed to their corporate charter and claimed that any genetic material derived from Draken 4 belonged to them by legal right. But something unexpected happened. Public opinion shifted. Footage of the convoy rescue went viral. The image of 2 dragons carefully dragging a wounded soldier to safety became iconic. People started asking questions. If Halion owned the dragons, did they also own the species' extinction? Did corporate property rights override moral obligations? Protests formed outside Halion offices on 3 different worlds. Coalition representatives who had stayed silent suddenly began speaking out. The story became bigger than 3 dragons. It became a question about humanity's relationship with other species, about corporate power versus ethical responsibility. David watched it all from the medical bay, where he remained with Scout, Shy, and Hum under constant observation. The dragons had grown again. They were the size of ponies now, their wings fully developed. They could fly short distances, and their telepathic communication was becoming more sophisticated. They learned to speak to others besides David. Shy had a long conversation with Lieutenant Shaw about fear and safety. Scout explained hunting strategies to fascinated xenobiologists. Hum shared memories of their species' history, fragmentary images passed down through genetic memory that a special tribunal was convened. David was called to testify. He stood in a formal chamber with representatives from Coalition Command, Halion Corporation, and the Senate Ethics Committee watching him. Corporal Reed, you were the first to make contact with the dragons. Tell us about that initial interaction. David described finding them in the ruined research station. He talked about their fear, their desperation, their immediate intelligence. He explained how the telepathic bond formed and how it had grown stronger over time. And you believe this telepathy constitutes sapient communication? I know it does. They don't just share feelings. They share ideas, memories, hopes. They make moral choices. They understand consequences. David looked directly at the tribunal members. They asked not to be abandoned. That's not instinct. That's a thinking being expressing a fundamental need. The Halion representative stood. The corporation has invested significant resources in dragon genetic research. These specimens represent decades of work and billions in potential applications. Declaring them sapient would invalidate legal property rights and set dangerous precedents. Dangerous for who? David asked. You're only here because you want to cut them apart and see what makes them valuable. You wiped out their entire species for profit. Now you want to finish the job. That's an emotional argument, not a legal one. Then let's make it legal. The dragons themselves can testify. Let them speak to the tribunal directly. There was a moment of shocked silence. Then the tribunal head nodded. Bring them in. Scout, Shy, and Hum entered the tribunal chamber with David walking between them. The three dragons had continued growing. They were magnificent now, their scales gleaming under the chamber lights. Scout's burgundy scales caught the light like polished metal. Shy's copper coloring seemed to glow from within. Hum's bronze-streaked gold made patterns that shifted when the dragon moved. The tribunal members stared. So did everyone else in the chamber. These weren't the small, frightened babies David had found weeks ago. These were powerful creatures who moved with grace and obvious intelligence. The tribunal head, an older woman named Administrator Chun, leaned forward in her seat. The tribunal recognizes the presence of the three dragon specimens. Are they capable of direct communication with this body? David felt the dragon's nervousness through their shared bond. They had practiced this, but actually doing it in front of so many strangers was different. Scout took the lead, as always. The dragon's telepathic voice projected outward, touching every mind in the chamber. We understand. We speak. We are here. Several tribunal members gasped. The Helion representative's face went pale. This wasn't second-hand testimony anymore. This was direct evidence, impossible to dismiss or explain away. Administrator Chun composed herself quickly. Can you tell us what you want? The three dragons communicated together, their telepathic voices blending into something stronger than any single one could produce alone. Images and emotions flowed with the words, creating a complete communication that was far richer than spoken language. They shared memories of their species' history, pulled from genetic memory passed down through generations. Once, dragons had lived across Drakenfor in great numbers. They had been peaceful, living in harmony with another species that built cities in the mountains. Then the mining ships came. The cities were destroyed. The dragons were hunted. Their world was stripped bare for its mineral wealth. The images shifted. 3 eggs hidden in a research facility. Scientists trying to resurrect a species they had helped destroy. Then violence. Evacuation. Abandonment. Tiny hatchlings alone in the dark, starving, terrified. Then David. A human who could have left them to die. A human who chose differently. We want to live, the dragons said simply. We want our world back. We want to be more than property or research material. We want David to stay with us. We want to be family. The chamber was silent. David felt tears running down his face again and still didn't care. The dragons pressed against him, their scales warm and solid and real. The Helion representative found his voice. This is manipulation. Emotional appeals designed to influence the tribunal. These creatures are using telepathy to cloud judgment. We share truth. Hum's voice said, surprisingly strong for the gentlest of the three. You cloud judgment with paper and words that mean nothing. We show what is real. Scout added, you killed our kind. You destroyed our world. You have no right to own what remains. The law disagrees, the representative argued. Salvage rights and corporate charter clearly establish ownership of all biological materials recovered from company property. Administrator Chen held up a hand for silence. The tribunal needs time to deliberate. This is unprecedented. We've never had a case where the subjects of property dispute could speak for themselves. She looked at David. Corporal Reed, you will maintain custody of the dragons pending our decision. Helion security team will be required to maintain distance unless the tribunal rules in their favor. The next 3 days were tense. David stayed with the dragons in a specially prepared area of the base. They practiced their telepathic communication, growing stronger and more articulate with each passing hour. Other soldiers visited, curious and supportive. The wounded soldier, Peters, spent hours with them, forming his own bond with Shy, who had helped save his life. Lieutenant Shaw worked around the clock, preparing additional evidence, and coordinating with legal experts across the coalition. She discovered something crucial buried in old mining records. Helion had claimed salvage rights to Draken 4 based on the planet being uninhabited. But the genetic memories the dragons shared proved otherwise. There had been another species living there, one that died defending the dragons. If Draken 4 was inhabited when Helion moved in, their charter is invalid, Shaw explained. They falsified initial survey reports to claim an uninhabited world. That's a coalition crime. David felt hope surge. Can we prove it? The dragons already did. Their memories are genetic records. They're essentially living proof of genocide. On the third day, the tribunal reconvened. The chamber was packed with observers, media representatives, and interested parties from across coalition space. David stood with Scout, Shy, and Hum, their telepathic bond humming with nervous energy. Administrator Chen looked exhausted but determined. The tribunal has reached a decision. However, before we announce it, there is new evidence that must be addressed. Lieutenant Shaw, please present your findings. Shaw stepped forward and outlined what she had discovered. The falsified reports, the evidence of an inhabited world, the legal implications of genocide. As she spoke, the Helion representative's confident expression crumbled. These are serious allegations, Chen said. Helion Corporation, how do you respond? The representative stood slowly. We will need time to review these claims and prepare a proper response. You'll have that opportunity. However, it directly impacts the current proceedings. If Helion's presence on Draken 4 was illegal, then all subsequent property claims are void. Chun turned to the dragons. Before we announce our decision on the sentience question, I want to ask you something directly. If you're granted legal personhood, what would you choose to do? The 3 dragons communicated silently for a moment. Then Scout spoke for all of them. We would go home, return to Draken 4, try to rebuild what was lost. There are genetic samples in the old research station. Possibility of more dragons, more family. And Corporal Reed, he comes with us. He is family too. He protects us. We protect him. That is what family does. She nodded slowly. She looked at her fellow tribunal members, who each gave slight nods of agreement. Then she turned back to address the full chamber. The tribunal finds that the 3 dragons known as Scout, Shy, and Hum demonstrate clear evidence of sapient thought, complex communication, moral reasoning, and self-determination. They are hereby granted provisional sentient status under coalition law, with full legal personhood to be confirmed after a 6-month observation period. The chamber erupted. David barely heard the rest over the sound of his own heartbeat. The dragon's telepathic voices filled his mind with joy and relief and hope. Chin wasn't finished. Additionally, pending investigation into Helion Corporation's activities on Draken 4, the planet is hereby designated as a protected world. All corporate claims are suspended. The dragons are appointed as primary stakeholders in any decisions regarding their homeworld. The Helion representative tried to object, but Chin cut him off. Furthermore, Corporal David Reed is assigned as official liaison and guardian to the dragon species, effective immediately. He will accompany them to Draken 4 and assist in any recovery efforts. David couldn't speak. The dragons pressed against him from all sides, their telepathic voices singing with happiness. They had won. Against corporations and regulations and impossible odds, they had actually won. That night, David sat with Scout, Shy, and Hum under the stars, planning their return to Draken 4. The dragons shared more genetic memories, showing him hidden places where their ancestors had lived, places that might still hold traces of their species. We go home soon, Scout said telepathically. All of us together, Shy added. Hum simply pressed close and hummed, the sound vibrating with contentment. David looked up at the stars, thinking about the ruined research station where this had all started. He had been following orders, doing a routine sweep. Instead, he had found family, purpose, a reason to fight against systems that measured value and profit instead of life. Tomorrow, they would begin preparations for the journey to Draken 4. But tonight, David just sat with 3 dragons who had chosen him as family, and let himself believe that sometimes, against all odds, the right choice was also the winning one. The transport ship descended through Draken IV's purple atmosphere, and David watched 3 dragons press their faces against the viewports like excited children. They had never seen their homeworld before. Everything they knew came from genetic memories, fragments of knowledge passed down through generations. Now, they were actually here. The landscape below was harsh. Mining scars cut across the terrain like wounds. Entire mountain ranges had been stripped away. What forests remained were thin and struggling. But there was beauty too. The purple sky shifted to orange at the horizon. Strange rock formations jutted up from valleys filled with crystalline sand. It was damaged, but not dead. Scout's telepathic voice filled David's mind. Home. This is home. The transport landed near the old research station where David had first found them. The building was still a ruin, but it was a starting point. They had supplies, equipment, and most importantly, hope. Over the next weeks, David and the dragons explored. The dragons' genetic memories guided them to places that had been important to their species. Ancient nesting grounds, hunting territories, social gathering sites. Most were destroyed or badly damaged, but some remained intact. In a hidden valley, they found caves that had somehow escaped the mining operations. The walls were covered in carvings showing dragons and another species living together. The extinct inhabitants of Draken 4 had been smaller than humans, with 6 limbs and faces that seemed built for smiling. The carvings showed them and dragons working together, hunting together, raising young together. They were friends, Shai said softly, touching the carvings with one claw. Our ancestors and theirs. They died protecting dragon eggs when the mining ships came, fighting so some could survive. David looked at the images and felt the weight of that sacrifice. An entire species had died, trying to save another. And for what? So Helion could extract minerals and make profit. The injustice of it burned in his chest. But dwelling on the past wouldn't change anything. They needed to focus on the future. Lieutenant Shaw had joined them, taking extended leave to help with the recovery effort. She was the one who discovered the research station's backup servers were still functional. The data was corrupted, but recoverable. It contained genetic samples, breeding protocols, and most importantly, viable dragon DNA. There's enough here to bring back the species, Shaw said, scrolling through data. It won't be easy. It'll take years, maybe decades. But it's possible. The 3 dragons processed this information silently, then shared it telepathically with David. He felt their complicated emotions. Joy at the possibility of more dragons. Sadness that it would take so long. Determination to see it through no matter what. Scout spoke for all of them. We will do it. We will bring our family back. They established a permanent base in the valley with the caves. Coalition scientists arrived to help with the genetic recovery project. More people came too, volunteers who wanted to help restore what had been destroyed. Engineers worked on cleaning the water systems. Biologists studied the struggling ecosystems. Slowly, Draken 4 began to heal. David's role shifted from soldier to guardian to something harder to define. He was teacher, friend, advocate, and family all at once. The dragons continued to grow, reaching their full size over the following months. Scout became massive, with a wingspan that could block out the sun. Shai remained smaller, but faster, capable of incredible aerial maneuvers. Hum grew large and steady, the foundation that held them all together. Their telepathic abilities grew too. They could now communicate complex ideas across kilometers. They could share memories and emotions with multiple individuals simultaneously. They began teaching human researchers about their species, sharing knowledge that had been thought lost forever. 6 months after the tribunal's provisional ruling, Administrator Chun returned to Draken 4 for the final evaluation. She toured the valley, saw the progress, met with the research teams. Then she sat down with David and the 3 dragons under the purple sky. I've read all the reports, Chen said. The genetic recovery program is ahead of schedule. The ecosystem restoration is showing promising results. And you three have demonstrated clear, consistent sapient behavior far beyond what was required for legal personhood. Scout rumbled contentedly. We passed your test. You've exceeded every expectation. Chun smiled. The tribunal's final ruling is unanimous. Full legal personhood is granted. Draken 4 is officially designated as your sovereign territory. No corporate or governmental entity can claim it without your explicit permission. The dragon's telepathic celebration was so powerful that everyone in the valley felt it. Pure joy radiating outward, touching every mind within range. David laughed as waves of happiness washed over him. That evening, more news arrived. The investigation into Helion Corporation's activities on Draken 4 had concluded. The company was found guilty of genocide, fraud, and numerous other violations. Their charter was revoked. Assets were being seized. The executives responsible were facing criminal charges. It didn't bring back the extinct species or undo the damage to the planet. But it was something. Justice, however, delayed. David sat with the three dragons at the entrance to their ancestral caves, watching the sun set over their scarred but recovering world. Shai leaned against his shoulder, now so large that David seemed tiny in comparison. Scout stretched out nearby, wings folded. Hum hummed softly, the sound echoing off the cave walls. When we first met, you were tiny, David said, scared and alone in that dark room. You stayed, Scout said. Could have left. Should have left by human law, but stayed. I couldn't leave you. We know. That is why you are family. Shai's telepathic voice was gentle. Not because you are human and we are dragons. Because you chose us when choosing was hard. David thought about all the regulations he had broken, all the rules he had ignored. If he had followed protocol, the dragons would be dead now, cut apart in some laboratory. Another extinct species, another footnote in history. Instead, they were here, alive, free, working to bring their entire species back from the edge of oblivion. More dragons would hatch soon from the recovered genetic samples. The valley would fill with young dragons learning to fly, learning to hunt, learning the history their ancestors had carried through extinction. Scout, Shai, and Hum would teach them, and David would be there, the human who had refused to leave them behind. What do you think about when you look at the stars? David asked. Hum responded, the quietest of the three finally speaking. We think about how small we are, how easily we could have been lost, how one human's choice to be kind saved everything. It wasn't just kindness. You three are worth saving. All beings are worth saving, Scout said. That is what you taught us. That is what we will teach others. The value of life is not measured in profit or power. It is measured in connections, in choices to protect instead of destroy. The stars came out, different from Earth stars, but beautiful in their own way. David had a message waiting from Lieutenant Shaw. The first batch of dragon eggs would be ready to hatch within a month. They needed to prepare nesting spaces, gather food supplies, plan for the arrival of the next generation. But that was tomorrow's work. Tonight, David simply sat with his family and watched the stars wheel overhead. Three dragons who had spoken the words that changed everything, who had asked him not to leave, and in return had given him a purpose worth fighting for. Shai shifted slightly, her copper scales catching starlight. We will never leave you either, she said telepathically, echoing those first desperate words from months ago. That is what family means. Staying together. Always. Scout and Hum added their voices to the sentiment, the three of them speaking as one. Always together. Always family. Always home. David closed his eyes and felt the telepathic bond that connected them all, stronger now than ever before. It hummed with contentment, with hope, with the absolute certainty that they had found exactly where they belonged on a damaged world slowly healing under purple skies. A human and three dragons sat together and planned their future. A future where extinct species could return, where corporations couldn't destroy with impunity, where one person's choice to protect the vulnerable could change everything. The mining scars would fade with time. The ecosystems would recover. More dragons would fill the skies. And through it all, David would be there, the guardian who had refused to leave when leaving would have been easier, because family wasn't about biology or species. It was about choosing to stay when staying mattered most. And David had made his choice the moment three small, terrified dragons had whispered into his mind and asked him not to leave them behind. He never would.